And Arizona, and I feel maybe it is time for Arizona's place in the sun. It's always in the sun, but its place in the sun in America hostility.
Yes, indeed. It's, I think the Harris campaign, when I talk to people behind the scenes in the campaign, they're not super confident about Arizona. They seem to be much, much happier about how they're doing in North Carolina. But of course, if they were to take Arizona, it would really, really help her campaign for the White House. And if Harris can't take Pennsylvania, the big prize with all of its 19 electoral votes, they probably do need to pick up someone like Arizona if she's going to make it to the White House.
Right. Arizona's not going to replace Pennsylvania by itself. It's got 11 electoral votes, so they need to find someplace else in those Sunbelt states. North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada wouldn't get them there either. So it would have to be a combination of Arizona and Georgia, or Arizona and North Carolina. But winning Arizona does make the path a little wider across Harris, gives you different. Mind Joe Biden went a narrowly by 270,000 votes. So it was not by any means a comfortable victory there before. And as you say, there are some signs that it might be trending a little bit more towards Donald Trump this time around. And I think immigration and border issues are one of the big reasons as well.
Yeah, of course, we know that that is one of the issues which Trump generally was much more better at than the president Harris. And obviously that's why Harris campaign, Harris himself is going to visit the border on Friday, and it'll be our first visit. Yes, our first visit since becoming a candidate as well. And this has been an issue that has really, really dogged him. There is this question of what her responsibility was as vice president towards the border. And Donald Trump likes to call her the border czar, so she absolutely failed in her responsibilities. In truth, actually, the mission she was given by President Biden was to try and stop so many people from Latin American countries wanting to come to America in the first place by improving their law, improving the economy, reducing violence in the countries that they were coming from. And so that's different from saying she was in charge of border security, but it is something that has been very much hung around her neck, and not least because of a fairly disastrous interview that she did about the border in 2021 with NBC's Leslie Bolton.
We are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe.
I was just at a J.D. Vance rally here in Travis, Michigan last night, talking to people, and people who were there, the Republicans who were there, said immigration was their top issue, even though, honestly, there aren't that many undocumented migrants or people seeking asylum who've been settled here in northern Michigan. It's really not that big a concern for the local governments here, the way it is in places like Chicago, but they still see it on TV. And J.D. Vance, in his speech, talked about high housing prices, and he blamed migration, undocumented and people allowed in legally, for driving up home prices, for driving up the prices of goods because it's increasing the amount of demand for it. Now, economists will say that's not really accurate, that it's just a drop in the bucket as far as housing demand goes. But you could tell J.D. Vance wants to connect immigration to the kind of economic issues that people are really hurting on, and that they say is across the board, across the country, the economy is a top issue for them.
And here's what we used to say about it, which is we're tying this in now to the Latino vote that we're going to be talking about in a second with a real expert in it. That in the past, I can remember when I was in the States for the BBC, more than 15 years ago now, people used to say, oh well, if you go on and on about illegal immigration, which some did in those days, you know what you're going to do? You're going to put off this fast-growing group of voters who are Latinos and who are going to feel, oh, you're after us because it's our brothers and sisters, metaphorically at least, who are coming over the border. What is fascinating this time around, and specifically, you look at a place like Arizona, where roughly a quarter of the voters are Latino. When you look at the polls, Sarah, there isn't much difference, is there, between what ordinary Americans who are not Latino believe about immigration and the need to tighten up on illegal immigration, and what those who describe themselves as Latinos think about it. I think a poll I was looking at recently suggested that I think 70%, something like that, of Americans approve of Biden cracking down on illegal immigration, which he's done in the last 6 months or so, and the figure for Latinos was 69%. In other words, there's no real difference at all, and that's really striking, isn't it?
Right. Something that you need to keep in mind also is that the Latino vote is not monolithic. This is an entire continent plus, two continents really, of migrants coming into the United States over, as you mentioned, Sarah, 100 years. And so there are multi-generations, people coming from Latin America, from Colombia or Venezuela or Brazil, probably have very different outlooks on politics, on the socialism versus capitalism, on dictatorships than people coming over from Mexico or from Central America, where they're dealing with gang violence and poverty. So they bring their politics from home here, their politics shaped based on where they settle here and who they're around, and all of that makes for something where it's very difficult to predict exactly what these different segments are going to view on immigration policy and how they're going to vote.
Right, as I say, in a moment we're going to be talking to a great expert on this with really interesting actually ideas about the importance of the Latino vote this time around. Ideas that it seems to me really potentially change the way we ought to be looking at the race. But before we do that, Anthony, you're busy, you've got to go.
I've got a plane to catch. I'm heading back to DC at least for a few days before I'm back out on the trail again. So really great to talk to both of you, and I'm sure we will be all chatting about all of this for the next month.
Bye.
Bye.
So, joining us now, Mike Madrid, who is a Latino Republican political consultant, though not a fan, it is fair to say, of Donald Trump. He's author of Latino Century, which is an absolutely brilliant book about, well, obviously the Latino vote and obviously, potentially, the Latino century. And Mike, what fascinates us as well, potentially before it becomes the Latino century, the Latino election this time round. Is it fair to say? I mean, I'm old enough to remember soccer moms and all the other kind of groups that the media have used. Is this the Latino election?
Yeah, for the first time in 30 years of being involved in this presidential campaigns, being asked that question. For the first time, yes, I think it is. The main reason why is because the size of the Latino vote in each of the 7 critical battleground states is going to be larger than the margin of victory in some cases.
isn't who these people are, is it?
Yeah, so